Well, welcome. Thanks for coming to this month's Evidence Synthesis Ireland webinar. We are so glad to have you with us today for another season of webinars. I'm going to give most of our time to our speakers, but before I pass over, I do just want to give a small introduction to Evidence Synthesis Ireland for those of you who may be new to us. So Evidence Synthesis Ireland is an initiative funded by the Health Research Board and the Research and Development Division of the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland. Our primary goal is to support and develop evidence synthesis knowledge, awareness, and capacity on the island of Ireland. And to that end, today we have with us Dr. Annie Synnot and Alecia Staines. Annie is a senior research fellow at Monash University and the consumer engagement lead for the Australian Living Evidence Collaboration, as well as the Living Evidence for Australian Pregnancy and Postnatal Care Guidelines. Her research focuses on how consumers/people with lived experiences can be partners in the production, dissemination, and use of evidence. Alecia, meanwhile, is the founder of Australia's leading maternity consumer organization, Maternity Consumer Network, and is involved with policy development at both the state and national level. She also mentors other consumers to engage with their local maternity services and with politicians to achieve access to better maternity services and more woman-centered care. Alecia has 6 children. That she has birthed in a range of settings, including hospital and at home. Today, Annie and Alecia are going to talk to us about how they designed, recruited, and supported a consumer engagement approach for the Living Evidence for Australian Pregnancy and Postnatal Care Guidelines. At the end of the talk, we'll open it up for some discussion and to take some questions. So if you would like to be a part of that, please go ahead and drop comments and questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll also record this session and make it available on our website after the day. But with that, I'll pass over to our lovely speakers. Annie, I think you're going to pull up some slides there, so I'll go ahead and turn myself off now.
Thanks, Joanna, and hi, everyone. Just get my slides presenter mode. Here we go. Great. So I'm so pleased to be with you today. This was a wonderful invitation to talk to you all. And I'm looking at the names of the participants and I don't recognise a single name, which is quite exciting for an evidence synthesis community. So I'd love it if you could pop in the chat where you're from. Is everyone mostly in Ireland or the UK, or whether there's anyone from other places? And maybe I'll get started while you pop in the chat where you're from. So we're talking to you about how we recruited a diverse consumer panel in the LEAPP guidelines, the Living Evidence for Australian Pregnancy and Postnatal Care. So the LEAPP project is funded by the Australian Department of Health and Aged Care. And as you've probably already heard, I will use the term consumers in this presentation, and so will Alecia probably, because that's the most common term in Australia. But by that term, I mean patients and the public. And I'll also use consumer engagement or consumer involvement, and that I'm using as a synonym for patient and public involvement. So I hope that's not too confusing. So the LEAPP guidelines or the LEAPP program is a 5-year living guideline development program that started last year and is going through till 2028. And the goal of the LEAPP program is to develop and maintain Australian national pregnancy and postnatal care guidelines. So it's actually 2 guidelines and they're being developed in parallel by the LEAPP team. LEAPP is a partnership led by the Australian Living Evidence Collaboration, where I work, and in partnership with the national body representing midwives and obstetricians and gynecologists, those 2 bodies. And there's 24 member organisations that are also partners in the LEAPP guidelines, and together all of those organisations form part of the steering committee. And most of those organisations are clinical groups that represent the interests of clinicians, but we also have the Maternity Consumer Network led by Alecia sitting on the steering committee. The presentation today is not about living guidelines per se, but I just didn't want to distract, the fact that these are living guidelines to distract from the presentation. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with living guidelines, they are still guidelines. They retain all the core guideline development steps, but with a living evidence model, those guidelines are produced and published, and then the searches continue to run so that any new evidence is incorporated, is identified, and can be incorporated into the review, so the guideline stays up to date. So with our LEAPP guidelines, we are in one case updating the old guideline, in another creating a new guideline, and continuing to produce recommendations and then update recommendations over the course of the 5 years. So Alecia, I'll pass to you.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Obviously it's night time in Australia. I don't even know what time it is over there. But as you can see, it's dark, and you might hear some barking geckos and things like that because I'm actually in the bush on holidays coming to you. I'm actually a teacher by trade. I am not a researcher. It's been 20 years since I finished my university studies, which I don't think is a bad thing because I'm actually an outsider. So there's things that I can pick up that perhaps researchers can't, particularly in the maternity space. It is something I became interested in when I realised very early on, after I had my firstborn, that I had access to a known midwife, which has the best outcomes according to evidence, but also I would say my anecdotal experience as well, and realising that not many women in Australia actually had access to that model. So I started off just volunteering, and then I could see a gaping big hole in this space in terms of pushing for that continuing midwifery care model. So when I got to having my third, I was a little bit bored on maternity leave, and I thought, why not set up a national organisation? It is so. Since we've had the last presentation, we're actually up to 1,300 members now and member organisations, and that is across all states in the country, and it will depend on what local women want. So today I was in a meeting because a group of women want publicly funded home birth. Last week I was in a meeting because a whole state, their maternity service is a bit of a dump, basically. So it really depends on what local women want and what I do from a mentoring point of view. But we are engaged in fairly high level stuff at federal and across each state as well. So I like to think of us as having a three-pronged approach, in that we do provide education to women, peer support, and produce our own education. We also have like training for staff. So that came about a couple of years ago. We developed respectful maternity care training based on the Respectful Maternity Care Charter, which is actually international. So if there's any maternity researchers, I'm sure you're familiar with that. We do a lot of advocacy as well. So whether that's through the media or meeting with MPs to push for better maternity services. And then as far as advisory goes, so whether it is helping political parties develop position statements or doing costings for them, but also providing consumer representatives. And so I know Annie defined earlier like a consumer, so that having that lived experience, but often I always think of a consumer might come with one story, and that will, in this case, it would be the woman's story. But as a consumer representative, I do try and represent the women who are telling me their stories, basically, and I decenter myself. And that's pretty much what we do as an organisation. We are made up of volunteers. We've recently got some funding to run some training in one state in the country, and otherwise there's about 8 of us that between us probably put in 40 to 50 hours a week running this type of organisation.
Thanks, Alecia. So impressive. And I was thinking, as you were talking, a number of times as we did this work together, you pushed me into places I wasn't sure, not that I didn't want to go, but you pushed me to do a bit better. And I think as a researcher or a guideline developer, you've got to be willing to move, willing to be challenged, and that takes a bit of don't know what, determination.
Yeah, I guess from my point of view, I'm I guess solution focused, and because I've been doing this now for nearly 14 years as a volunteer, it's easy to see gaps and where things could easily be improved. And I probably am pretty stubborn when it comes to that and think, no, I've seen this before. This is how it's got to be.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. You've got a wealth of experience. All right. So I was just going to take a step back and look at some concepts that are sort of relevant to thinking about diversity or involving marginalised groups. And so I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the concept of health equity, and just wanted to touch on how that applies to guidelines. So guideline recommendations are not always universally applicable across different populations of patient groups. So some people in the community may have a more difficult time than others in accessing particular treatments. They may have different preferences about the kind of treatment or care that they receive. And so guidelines can unintentionally result in poorer health outcomes for people from marginalised groups if they don't think about and consider some of those differences. And this really lovely graphic on the right there is the wheel of privilege and power, which I really like, and I think partly because it's just got the most beautiful colours, but the factors around the edge, so wealth, housing, body size, mental health, neurodiversity, sexuality, ability, all of those factors, most of those factors are things that we can't change about ourselves. And so if you sit out on the margins, out on the edges of the circle, you are more marginalised, you have less power and privilege. And if you sit towards the middle, you have more power and privilege in society. So health inequities are differences in people's health that are unnecessary, avoidable, unfair and unjust. And they are caused by those socioeconomic, cultural, structural factors that can influence people's access to health care. And I was reflecting on that wheel of privilege and power when it comes to thinking about consumer engagement. So when you've got health professionals and consumers sitting in the same meeting, you've instantly, the health professionals have got more power and privilege than the consumers in the room. But equally, if you have got a group of consumers and they will have varying levels of difference among them, and there will be a power differential too in amongst the consumers in the room. And that's relevant for when we were thinking about involving people who we haven't involved really before in Alex guideline work. So yeah, I really like that graphic. So guideline developers might think about addressing equity in their guidelines in different ways. And so one way might be to really interrogate the evidence that they find and have a look for any differential health effects, or have a look at difference in preferences and things in the literature about those people from different groups. But another approach is to directly work with people from diverse backgrounds in the guideline development process. But when I've looked at, and I think, this would probably make sense to most people anecdotally, when I've looked at some of the evidence and looked at a lot of examples of guideline developers who've involved consumers in some great ways in their guidelines, quite often they say that they wanted to engage people from diverse groups, but it was particularly challenging. They tried, but they were unsuccessful. So it's a bit of a stumbling block for guideline developers in terms of how to do this. So I did a scoping review a couple of years ago, looking at how to broaden the diversity of consumers engaged in guidelines. And I took a very inclusive stance in terms of including research papers, guidance documents, consensus workshops, anything that I could try and scrape and get some guidance about how to broaden diversity of consumers engaged in guidelines. And this is some of the key findings, was organisational partnerships, so partnering with the groups that represent the views of diverse people from diverse backgrounds, perhaps co-designing the engagement with those organisational groups, tailoring the recruitment to the specific populations and doing so via partner organisations, providing clear expectations and offering additional training and support, thinking what you can do from the guideline developer side and making sure that anyone who's working with directly with those consumers is skilled and culturally sensitive. Thinking, you know, there's that power sort of lens again, thinking about what can you do to make it a psychologically safe space. So either including more people or focusing on doing things just with consumers so that you make it a space that people feel they can actively contribute, and reducing other barriers to involvement. So payment is particularly important in this context, and also thinking about offering additional methods for involving people. So if we look at the LEAPP guidelines, this is how we actually involve people. So I'll take you through what our consumer engagement model is, and then that'll sort of inform how that did inform how we recruited. So with our guideline development program, we have the evidence team who reviews the recommendations, and they then those recommendations are then considered by a 16-member consumer panel. So that's an advisory group, not a decision-making group, but really they still function in much the same way as the other clinical panels. And we have 2 chairs and 2 deputy co-chairs of that consumer panel. The recommendations then go to the clinical panel, so the pregnancy panel and the postnatal panel, and our 4 chairs, split at that point. So 2 sit on the pregnancy panel and 2 sit on the postnatal panel, and then they come back together to sit on the guidelines leadership group. So all of those groups in sequence consider the recommendations, the draft recommendations. So the 4 chairs can sort of prosecute the case of the consumers. They've heard and all the consumers' views in the meeting, and then they take it forwards to the subsequent meetings and can really speak to those views. And then we have the steering committee, and we have Alecia, who sits on the steering committee as the organisational rep. And all the all the groups meet every 3 months, and they mostly meet for 2 hours. So the consumer panel meets for 2 hours. So that was the roles that we were recruiting for with this work. So just wanted to take you through what we thought about when we thought about diversity in the LEAPP context. So some of you would be familiar with the Progress Plus acronym. That's used a lot in systematic reviews and guidelines to think about those factors that are on the wheel of privilege and power. So the kind of social and cultural factors that can inform health equity. And so for us, we had 3 different types of diversity, I guess, we were thinking about. So it's not just cultural diversity or other kinds of sort of Progress Plus diversity. We were also interested in a diversity of lived experience. So we wanted people who were pregnant within the last 5 years and had a variety of pregnancy and postnatal journeys. And in fact, when we were talking about this, I was talking about this with Alecia, I originally said I wanted people who'd been pregnant within the last 10 years, because I wasn't sure that we would find enough consumer reps who had the headspace and had enough time to get their skills up as a consumer rep if we made it only 5 years. And Alecia said, make it 3 years, which I then thought, no, we just won't find anyone that has had a baby within the last 3 years, foolishly. So we made it 5 years was where we wanted to land. And then I do remember going to Alecia and said, these are the different kinds of social and cultural diversity that we would like to ensure that we have across these 16 women. And so we had a discussion about what we would need to do to lower the barriers to participation, to actually get some of these people putting their hand up and making it a successful experience for them. So rather than saying we wanted to have everyone had experience as a consumer rep, we said, let's get some people who are really experienced, and they will have the roles like the chair, the co-chair or deputy co-chair. But let's open the door to people who have no experience as a consumer rep, and let's think about what is needed to support them to sort of gain skills and confidence. So we wanted some people who had some experience contributing to guidelines, but not everyone. And sometimes when you're representing or recruiting consumer reps, you might say that you want people who are linked with an organisation or formally kind of connected with other voices, as Alecia was saying, who can bring not just their own lived experience, but the experiences of a range of women. So instead of saying that people had to be formally connected to an organisation, we said that they just had to have some kind of connections. It could be even like Facebook groups or informal connections, so that they were immersed in the stories of other women. Alecia, you look a little bit busy there, but did you want to add anything?
Always juggling. No, but one thing I guess to add or expand on that, being in this space for so long, like I see that there is something unique that just a consumer can bring that not necessarily is a consumer representative. And I guess when I saw that and you wanted all consumer representatives, well, I knew it was going to be tough to find that many from across Australia, but I just know from our interactions with certain groups of women too, that if we had gone down that route of just wanting all consumer reps, that we probably wouldn't have got the migrant representation that we did and things like that. So yeah, and I think overall the group meshed nicely together because there is that range. There's something unique, I think, when you've got that very raw consumer experience, that it's just as valuable as a consumer rep in my mind.
That's right. And so I probably should say we did actually achieve that. So we do actually have a panel that reflects the Australian population. It does have people who represent or who have those demographic characteristics. And we got nearly all Australian states and territories. So we did actually achieve a very diverse consumer panel. So in terms of how we went about it, so Alecia and I worked together on that consumer engagement model. So I was actually unsure if we would find people who would want to do the role of the chair and whether that was too much to expect them to do 3 meetings every 3 months. But Alecia assured me that we wouldn't have trouble finding people for those roles, and we didn't. So we also drafted a terms of reference together, and then Alecia really led on the recruitment. And so some of the things we were thinking about, just are really mindful of these people that might not have experience as a consumer rep and wanting to invite them into this process, was to think about being really clear, obviously plain language, but also very inclusive and welcoming language. Alecia encouraged us to use an online form, so people didn't have to download a PDF and submit a written application. And then we formed a selection panel with myself and Alecia and one other consumer, Michelle King, who had previously chaired Living Guidelines consumer panel for us in a different clinical area. We all assessed the applications, and then we interviewed a short list of them and then offered 16 women the position. So
You need to
we
talk a little bit
actually,
about the recruitment.
yeah, that's on the next slide.
Oh, yeah, just checking.
Yeah, yeah. And we received 101 applications. So I don't know if what Alecia thought about how high that was, but we were totally blown away because most people tell me, how do you find consumers? And this was, yeah, amazing. And I think testament to the power of Maternity Consumer Network. I'll give you the next slide, Alecia.
I actually was surprised myself. Like, I knew we would more than fill it. And some of it was because we mentor these smaller organisations and have a pretty good relationship with other consumer organisations. But there was actually groups of women that I had personally approached and said, I think you should apply for this. So if I knew a migrant woman, whether she'd come to us for advocacy help or had been doing a little bit of consumer representation engagement, I'd personally approach them because I just know from a cultural point of view, my partner's a migrant too, and he's like, we just don't even do this stuff. Like, you're expecting us to know this stuff that it's not even, we don't even do this stuff in our country. So I had personally approached some women and said, I think you should apply for this. And they still had to apply like everyone else, like it was no favors. But that's how we got that diversity as well, was personally just saying, here's a link. And then sending it to other consumer groups as well. And yeah, just social media, it's really the place where millennials and, the amount of engagement otherwise, like, they just don't read newsletters, they don't read the newspaper. So for us, yes, it was really social media and mainly Instagram and Facebook was the recruitment, outside of me, personally either emailing or inboxing someone. And, I knew in the consumer space and saying, I think you should apply for this. And yeah, looking through the list, I didn't know everyone, but either they'd interacted on the Maternity Consumer Network page or we'd helped them, or, I knew that they were in another organisation had worked on guidelines and things like that.
Mm. Which was then really helpful when we did our selection, our shortlists and stuff, when we had a sense of, sometimes you'd say you don't know them, but you know of them, or you've seen them contributing or whatever.
Carl, they won't be easy to work with, Carl. No. It did, was like, oh, like, we want to get the makeup of this right as well, but having so many of them, not just to meet the threshold for diversity, but also you wanted a group that was going to get stuff done basically as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the purpose of the interviews, actually, was to just do a bit of a sense check that they would be a good contributor to the group. It wasn't all about their the diversity characteristics that they could bring. So this is just an example of some of our application form questions. Just a little bit more conversational, I suppose. Why are you interested in being part of it? Describe a time you participated in a meeting. What are your connections with other consumers or other women? So then we thought about what needs to happen.
That actually brought up, Annie, I will just say that I think that helped making it online. So, women who were breastfeeding could just fill it in, like it was not so cumbersome. I find this whole download, have to cut and paste it into another document, then type it all up, was really cumbersome. I definitely think that helped with recruitment. But as we mentioned before, it gave women an opportunity who weren't necessarily linked to a consumer group, but might have been running a Facebook group. Or I remember there was one woman, she's like, oh, I've got like a group chat of like 80 or 90 women who've just had babies. And so that was, it was not the traditional definition of consumer representative, like that you have to be tied to an organisation to have them endorse you. But I think that's the new generation of consumer reps, that they're just a little bit different in the way that that they've moved away from that traditional sense of consumer representation, and they're doing it in their own way.
That's really true. And I think that's the other thing about the maternity space is the average age of a woman having her first baby is about 30. So it's a very different group of people than like when you're thinking about consumers in chronic disease, which is generally older people. So you have to think a bit differently for those of us like, you know, who work as consumer engagement people. So yeah, then we had to think about how do we make it an inclusive and also impactful in the sense of giving people an opportunity to really make an impact. So here's just some of the things that we thought about and we did. We made sure that the chairs were really inclusive and that they were very experienced so that they could not only chair the meetings and be that sort of senior leadership and also work with me to plan out the meetings and provide input in between meetings as needed, but also to be available as mentors to any of the newer consumers who wanted it. Alecia also offered some informal mentoring at the start, and a few people I think rang and had a chat with Alecia when they first started to get a bit of help. We worked together to devise a group agreement on how we would run the meetings, which I think was a worthwhile process. Obviously, the LEAPP team tries to focus on plain language and non-patronising explanations. We had a dedicated staff member, that was me, to support the panel. I'm quite big on seeking feedback from consumers. So after every meeting, I had an anonymous online form, which I just asked what's working well, what needs improving and how, and actually actioning some of that. So on the next slide, I'll talk about some of the things that we've implemented as a result of that feedback. We now have a formal process evaluation running alongside the LEAPP guidelines. So the process evaluation's taken the place of my online form. We also send meeting documents in advance, which is pretty standard, but we just really flag the fact that some topics may be sensitive and people can contribute in other ways. And we pay an honorarium, which is a pretty decent rate. It's 200 Australian dollars for meeting participants, which is sort of at the upper end of what you might get, but it reflects the nature of the sort of national role. And so some of the things we've added over time in response to feedback we've received is around relationship building. So the chairs started a WhatsApp group for the panel members to communicate between meetings. We added an item on the agenda where people get to share a bit about what's their news in the maternity consumery space, what else they've been working on outside of LEAPP. One of the chairs now just kindly checks in with anyone that has been a bit quieter during a meeting to check if there's anything else they'd like to say or they'd like to be called upon to say something. And I've done a few post-meeting check-ins with some of the quieter members or people who've been unable to attend, just checking if they're comfortable with their level of input, or if they haven't attended, if there's anything we can do to make it easier for them to attend. And so, Alecia, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I guess at the very start too, for those who were green, so just coming in as consumers, we did that little bit of training around this is what a consumer representative is, and this is how it came about, like giving them some background that it was the woman-centered care national maternity strategy and just some very basic consumer representative training, even though there were just some consumers there. Only because I would see that in meetings where we would get very green consumers and they would almost use it as an opportunity to debrief, whether it's birth or whatever. And so, and it was just because the expectations were never set out well. So just, I think giving them that has probably given them some guidance. And I've looped back to a few that I, knew through Maternity Consumer Network, and all of it is quite positive. And I know, we talked about a certain panel member just being very quiet. But then when I spoke to her, she's like, no, I'm really enjoying this. So I think it's personality and probably the cultural stuff as well, just being a bit reserved. So as far as from all of the consumer stuff I've done in 13 years, the fact that consumers and I'll say consumers, but it was really me, was engaged the whole way through, rather than just, oh, we'll have a quick discussion and then Annie goes and does it and then comes back and I'll be like, oh no, it's a dog's breakfast. I'm actually doing this in another group now. And that's what happened. They came to consumers early on and then went and did it and then have come back and it's at meeting stage. I'm like, well, why are clinicians in the consumer panel? Like, I'm really confused here. Oh, have I done this wrong? And I was like, well, see, this is what happens if you don't engage consumers the whole way through and it's just intermittent. You drop the ball on things. So it is quite unique because I've not seen this done so well anywhere. And I offer my skills pretty much for free to set researchers up and things like this. And I find that it's not consistent and the co-design doesn't happen the whole way through. So you don't get the output, basically. You don't get that good consumer engagement like we've had with this consumer panel because you followed it all the way through and, had really good co-design, I think.
That's great to hear. So, and I think, as you say, we've seen it with the impact of what the panel's been, how the panel has impacted the guidelines. So this is a couple of slides. This is actually the feedback document that we send back to the consumer panel. We've actually instigated this as a result of feedback too. So what we send them is what the recommendations looked like before the consumer panel saw them and what they looked like after the consumer panel saw them. So it documents what's changed. And this is an example. This is a postpartum bleeding recommendation. So, and the orange, this is what it looked like before they saw it. And afterwards, we had more practical advice. So it used to say, if they pass clots, tissue or membranes, and now it says larger than a plum, like clots larger than a plum. So more practical advice about what does large, what does heavy actually look like. And we did actually, people were talking about whether we could say the clot was larger than a 50-cent piece. And one of the consumers from a migrant background said, in an emergency, I couldn't remember how big an Australian 50-cent piece is. So it became larger than a plum. So such incredibly kind of helpful practical advice. The guidance went from having one recommendation to 2 consensus recommendations. So it's split between what to do in a normal situation versus what's an emergency situation. And then a new good practice statement that was about the fact that women need to be reminded of this information at every postnatal visit because they're not in the headspace to take this on only once. So some quite important but also large changes to the recommendations. So these recommendations then went to the postnatal panel, then to the guidelines leadership group, and then they were signed off at SteerCo. And this slide takes the recommendations after the consumer panel. So that's what you saw on the previous slide, and then shows you the published recommendations. So a little bit more in the published recommendation, but nothing lost from what the consumers added at the first meeting. So the recommendations themselves are hugely informed by the consumer panel's input. I think that's from having the consumer panel go first as well.
Well, I think because you've got so many on there, Annie, like traditionally you would have, say, a clinician panel with 1 or 2 consumers, and the clinicians always drown out, and I don't think it's intentionally, but always drown out the consumer voice. Whereas because you've got it standalone, they're a lot more confident in what they're saying. There's no, with this, the evidence says this. Is like the consumer saying, well, actually, as women, this is what we need to hear in our postpartum experience. So you've kind of elevated their voice, and because there's 16 of them, I think their confidence is a lot more, as opposed to if there was only a couple in a room with mostly clinicians, or online with mostly clinicians as well.
And I think the chairs are they're used to being in meetings, being the only consumer in a meeting with clinicians. But I imagine that having been immersed in 16 women's views, that then kind of gives them some real confidence to take them forwards into the subsequent meetings. So this is, I'm aware that we're going much further into time than I thought we were, but this is, so I won't take too much more time, so there's time for discussion and questions, but this is just an example of from the process evaluation. This is the PEAT-6, the Patient Evaluation Engagement Tool, and it covers off 6 questions that I think quite nicely cover what it means to do good engagement. And so we asked 10 of our 16 consumers filled out this survey. Each item is scored on a like-it scale out of 7. So the higher the score, the better people are feeling about it. So scoring 5s and 6s for the extent that people believe their ideas are heard, their contributions are taken seriously, they're able to influence the final outputs, etc. And this is a quote from Emma, who's one of our consumer panel chairs. What's unique about the LEAPP model is there isn't just one person tasked with advocating for consumer involvement. It's an entire team. At all levels of the hierarchy, the consumer voice is valued and staff make an effort to engage us with respect. And then similar levels of satisfaction from everybody else involved in the guidelines. So the evidence team, the clinicians on the panels, and the steering group members. We surveyed 51 of those people, and over 80% were somewhat or extremely satisfied with how the LEAPP program is engaging consumers. And these are 2 quotes from our clinical fellows, our midwife fellow and our obstetrician fellow. And the quote by Nisha is pretty powerful. It can be really uncomfortable when your clinical expertise is challenged by the lived experience of a consumer. I've learned to sit with this discomfort and genuinely listen to consumers. Not only had this made the guidelines more robust, but it's made me a better clinician. So some pretty powerful stuff, really. And here we are at our last slide. So Alecia and I workshopped these take-home messages for a previous presentation, which was really, if you would like to, and I would say that I certainly don't have all the answers on this and I'm not the expert, but our thoughts were, if you're wanting to engage consumers from diverse backgrounds, have you got the resources and capacity to lower the barriers to participation for people from diverse backgrounds? And if you do, then you need to partner with experienced or connected consumers to plan and conduct the engagement and the recruitment. I think it was Alecia's point, it's relationships, 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 and that's certainly borne out in the literature too. So did you want to offer any final thoughts, Alecia?
I think for me, sitting on the steering committee, it makes my job easier because I know that it's already been through a really thorough consumer process, as opposed to being the, one of very few consumers on that steering committee. And my brain is just going in overdrive, trying to, get all through all the information. Is this consumer friendly enough? Whereas it kind of takes, I feel like, the heat off me because I know it's been through such a robust consumer process as well. But as I mentioned before, by far this in 13 years of being involved in consumer representation and this kind of work has been the best I have seen, because it's been co-designed and you've taken on feedback the whole way through. So I guess it's probably, in my mind, like best practice, and it should be what should be replicated in that research base and guideline development.
Thanks, Alecia.